And today I'm here with Jim Feil, who is a community favorite in the PPN Healing School. And he's done several wonderful webinars, from short ones to long full day ones. And so it's wonderful to have you back in the school, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Kate. It's wonderful to be back, even though I'm sitting in Barcelona, but it's still nice to be back, even if it's online.
Well, this is a wonderful short course, and hopefully we can have you do some more live in-person things coming over, from Europe into our our United States community. But for now, we're going to be hosting you again to do a short course, which is called, let's see, the Archetypal Pulse and the Kinetic Chain, their roles in resolving trauma and restoring health. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't talk about that with us a little bit, Jim, say a little bit more about what you're going to teach.
Yeah. Well, the title kind of talks about two different strands in working with people. They're both very powerful. The archetypal pulse is a term that I drew from Stanley Keleman, who's one of my main inspirations and teachers. And that there is this underlying pulse. We know life is pulse. It's about as simple as it gets, but it's not just the pulse, the circulatory pulse, or the respiratory pulse, and so forth. There are deep underlying rhythms and pulses from which all of the physiological and musculoskeletal, all the different activities of the body are supported by and emerge. Yeah. And as I mentioned a little bit in my description, right, the biodynamic, cranial biodynamic community, the polarity community talk about the long tide, the breath of life, the deep pulse. But then you have a lot of different sources that talk about something similar, a kind of a deep pulse that everything else builds on, like an animating force, a life force. And so when that becomes experiential, it's always there, but most of us are pretty much in our lives and in our activities, and we're using energy, in a way, outwardly into life activities, which is pretty natural. But when one begins to have a more experiential sense of this pulse, it's very powerful. And one way to access that pulse is by, what you could call the kinetic chain, but you could also just call it our actual behaviors, right? Our life is action, right? We survive and we thrive because we act in the world in all the different ways that we do. And so all of our actions, whether we're not normally aware of it, are supported by this pulse and get their force and their motivation from this pulse. It's hard to get a feeling for the actual work from the words. The experience of it really shows you what we're talking about. But there is this way in which, as people come to a practice and begin to tell their stories, they're always acting it out. It's even though there's a content and the events and the emotions and the difficulties and so forth, the crises, the dilemmas, they're in that and talking about it, and they have kind of an experience of it, but they're always acting it out. And what Keleman appreciated, others in their own way, but Keleman in a very specific way appreciated how much information is in this whole active kind of kinetic dimension, which doesn't actually come through in the story content itself. It's a very special kind of, and there are other somatic therapies that appreciate some of that, so it's not totally original, but Keleman has given it a very powerful slant, and so the work is about having people come into practice, as usual, to begin to tell their stories, and we begin to track the action of the story, the behavior of it, and particularly through the hands, but through the postures, but in a different way from a lot of body reading. And we work with rhythm and slowing And we work with building frames of important moments, sort of action frames. And what starts to happen is there begins to be a dialogue between the action of the story and this deeper pulse, which really is a very kind of almost an inspirational quality. To give you a couple of examples, I had, our practices run in kind of phases. And I recently had several people who had just lost somebody important. So they were really in grief mode. A brother, a very close friend and so forth. And they came in kind of really in a way, as we would understand it, really touched and kind of dominated by the grief. And so we went to work on looking at actually the shape and the form of their grief, using the gestures. And a very interesting thing happened. In both cases, the grief was very authentic, very real. But when they did the work, one man started to sort of went into a kind of a deeper sense of himself and touched into a whole current of joy.
Yeah.
And it surprised him because he was in grief, and yet this pulse carries very powerful qualities, life-giving qualities. And so logically, you're either in grief or you're in joy. And he was suddenly feeling something, a very joyful wave underneath his loss, his sense of loss. And as we continued to work with it, he actually accessed a certain kind of a sense of power. All of it really in this dialogue between the pulse and the gestures and the actions. And so at the end of the session, he was incredibly, kind of, I don't know, he was just sitting in himself in a very unusual way where he was living through the grief, living through the loss, but in a very resourced way, and it was very interesting. And then a couple of these other clients had something very similar where they were dealing with the grief, and then by working in this particular way, slowing it down, and having them do some processes, with their own gestures and movement. And they touch a very deep level of connection, which is inherent in this pulse. So I'm trying to describe it as well as possible, but it's an experience that shows up as people work this way with dilemmas and crises and challenges and losses. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on. And it's called formative work. I draw that from Keleman's Formative Psychology, but I'm teaching a version of it. And so it has to do with the forms that we create to deal with the different situations that show up in our lives, whatever they are. Because we create responses and behaviors and so forth. But it's a very sophisticated process involving, our motor capacity. Of course, the nervous system engages it in a number of different ways, unavoidably. But there's also a use of energy, a metabolic process that has to support the action and the autonomic responses. So it's a very interesting package, and it goes into this work, I think in a very unique, special way, even though it resonates with other types of somatic work.
Yeah.
So that's a little short description of it to the extent that one can describe the process.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jim. I feel like I asked you to teach this. I really feel like so many people, I mean, if you're not a biodynamic craniosacral therapist, it's a bit of a mystery as to what the pulse is and what it is, because you transmit that and you track it, and you're not working with people on tables. You're working with them through Zoom or in person.
Interactively, yeah.
And the quality of your presence and being able to come just up against the boundary of the person very respectfully, and then amplify this deeper rhythm and pulse while working with whatever the imprint or situation is that's there. And when I hear you talk, what I'm hearing is that you drop people into their truer self, their essential quality of joy underneath the grief, and that's what's possible. I mean, I feel like your work really is a great skill to have, everybody to have when they're working with people. The somatic, it's a somatic work. It's not not necessarily cognitive, but you have a lot of storytelling as a part of
Sure.
your work. So it's a wonderful blend, and we're very fortunate to have you again.
Well,
And
thank you,
um,
Kate.
those dates are the June 12th, 19th, 26th, and July 3rd at noon to 2 Eastern time. And so all this will be connected. I'll put it in the show notes underneath for YouTube people listening, but please come join us and continue to learn from this wonderful teacher, Jim Feil.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. Great.